The first thing he asked me for was a signature. Not money, not time, a signature. I was 37 and had just sold my second company. Not the kind of exit that made headlines, but enough to buy freedom quietly. I'd moved to a smaller city on purpose, rented a loft with bad acoustics, and told myself I'd take a year before deciding what came next. My money was liquid. My calendar was empty. My authority existed mostly on paper. He was the building manager's brother. That's how he introduced himself when he knocked on my door one morning with a clipboard and an apology. He said they were updating emergency access permissions for the building, and that my unit hadn't returned the form yet. He said he'd been sent because he was good with people. He was. He didn't step inside. He didn't look past my shoulder. He stood in the hallway and explained which boxes needed initials and which were optional. He said I could read it later if I preferred. He said he'd be back all week. I signed then. It was a boilerplate form. I'd signed worse without reading. He thanked me, tore off the carbon copy, and said he'd see me around. I noticed him after that. In the lobby. In the mailroom. Once on the roof, watering plants that weren't his responsibility. He always acknowledged me first, never lingered, never pretended familiarity. When we spoke, it was about the building noise complaints, package thefts, minor leaks. He framed everything as prevention. He said prevention saved everyone time. I learned he was 30, recently divorced, shared custody. He said it plainly, without bitterness. He said his ex-wife was organized and that he respected that. He said disorganization caused more conflict than betrayal. That phrasing caught. A few weeks in, there was a water issue in my unit. Not flooding, just a ceiling stain that suggested something slow and hidden. He came up with another man, took photos, explained timelines. He said insurance would likely want documentation. He asked if I preferred to handle it myself or let them coordinate. I said they could. That was the first handoff. After that, things were smoother than they should have been. Repairs approved quickly. Emails answered fast. When I asked how he managed it, he said people responded better when they felt guided instead of chased. He started texting updates instead of emailing. Short ones. Status changes. No emojis. No filler. One night, he mentioned that my unit was technically eligible for a property tax adjustment because of a zoning change that hadn't been widely advertised yet. He said most owners wouldn't notice. He said renters didn't usually care. He said I should, given my situation. I asked what my situation was. He said unattached ownership was easier to reclassify. He offered to walk me through the paperwork. He said it was tedious but straightforward. He said he'd helped a few residents already. We sat at my kitchen island. He didn't sit too close. He slid documents toward me, explained sections, flagged where mistakes usually happened. He didn't rush. He didn't touch my arm. When I thanked him, he said it was part of his job, even though it wasn't. That night, after he left, I realized I hadn't once wondered what he wanted. That felt like a relief. After that, he became my point of reference for anything that involved the building. Not because I needed one, because it was easier. If a package went missing, he already knew which delivery window it had been in. If the elevator stalled, he explained which vendor handled which failures and why it mattered. He didn't dramatize problems. He narrowed them. I noticed how often he used phrases like cleanest path and least resistance. He spoke the language of someone who'd learned how to move systems without challenging them. The tax adjustment paperwork moved faster than expected. He texted once to say the assessor had flagged a question and that he'd clarified it. He said they appreciated proactive residents. He said it helped when people understood process. I didn't ask how much of that clarification had come from him. He began stopping by occasionally. Not announced. Not intrusive. He'd knock, ask a question about access or timing, then leave. Sometimes he stayed long enough to accept a glass of water. He never sat unless I insisted. He talked about his daughter carefully, how she liked routine, how transitions made her quiet. He said co-parenting was mostly logistics once you removed ego. He said he'd learned that too late. I noticed how that story positioned him. Responsible. Adapted. Past the chaos. At some point, he asked if I was planning to stay in the city long term. I said I didn't know yet. He said that flexibility was an asset, but that it complicated classification. He smiled when he said it as if it were an inside joke. Classification became a recurring word. He pointed out that my unit was listed as owner-occupied even though I wasn't registered locally yet. He said it was a common lag. He said it could be corrected or leveraged depending on timing. He said I didn't need to decide immediately. I asked what leverage meant. He said abatements, exemptions, temporary reductions. He said municipalities liked clarity, but they rewarded people who arrived with paperwork already aligned. He offered to draft a summary for me, not a recommendation, just options. The summary was thorough, neutral, written in a way that assumed competence. I appreciated that more than persuasion. I signed one more form, then another. Always things that made sense individually, always framed as reversible, always positioned as interim. He never asked for money. That mattered to me. What he did ask for was permission. To list me as a contact on a zoning inquiry, to mention my unit in a broader reclassification batch, to use my timeline as a reference point because it was cleaner than most. Each time he asked before acting. Each time I said yes because nothing seemed to shift materially afterward. I told myself that trust was cumulative. One evening, as he was leaving, he mentioned that the building might be converted to mixed use in the next few years. He said it casually as future context. He said early positioning mattered if you wanted optionality later. I asked whether that affected me. He said not yet. That answer felt responsible. I didn't notice how often not yet began to sit between me and certainty. The shift happened when he stopped explaining outcomes. Instead, he started narrating inevitabilities. A letter arrived from the city about a pending reassessment. Neutral language. No numbers yet. Just notice. I forwarded it to him out of habit. He replied within minutes, said it was expected, said it meant things were moving on schedule. I asked what schedule. He said hours. That was the first time he used a possessive without softening it. We met that evening in the lobby. He didn't bring papers. He spoke instead, outlining how reassessments often triggered temporary classifications. How temporary classifications could be appealed. How appeals, if timed correctly, could anchor future valuations. He said I was positioned unusually well. He said most owners stumbled into these windows blind. I asked whether there was risk. He said there was always risk, but that he was managing exposure. I noticed he said managing, not reducing. He asked for access to one more document, proof of funds related to my purchase. He said it would help demonstrate continuity. He said it wouldn't be filed, just referenced. I hesitated. He noticed. Immediately. He said we could skip it. He said it wasn't critical. He said he just liked to be thorough. I sent it anyway. After that, things accelerated. Mail arrived addressed to an LLC I hadn't registered yet. He said it was a placeholder name the city sometimes generated automatically. He said we'd correct it once the reassessment finalized. I asked why the name included his last name. He said that was coincidence. He said the system autofilled from a batch. That explanation didn't sit cleanly, but it didn't alarm me either. It felt like one of those quirks that disappeared once you pulled on it. He began CCing me on emails I didn't fully understand. Threads with planners, consultants, attorneys whose signatures were blocky and impersonal. I skimmed. I trusted his summaries. He started using phrases like beneficial owner and temporary steward. He said they were technical terms. He said not to get hung up on them. One afternoon, I received a call from a bank asking to verify a letter of intent tied to a commercial reclassification. They asked if I was aware my unit was being positioned as part of a larger asset group. I said no. They apologized and said they'd been told coordination was centralized. I called him immediately. He didn't deny it. He reframed it. He said grouping units reduced volatility. He said volatility was what triggered scrutiny. He said individual owners benefited from being part of something orderly. He said nothing was finalized. I asked where my consent fit into this. He said consent was implied through participation. I said that wasn't how consent worked. He paused, then said we should talk in person. When he came up, he didn't bring the clipboard anymore. He brought a laptop. He sat at my table like it belonged to him and opened documents I hadn't seen before. He said things had gone further than expected. He said opportunities had appeared once the city flagged the building. He said backing out now would be messy. He said mess drew attention. I asked whose opportunity this was. He said ours again, but this time with emphasis. I realized then that I hadn't been positioned as a beneficiary. I'd been positioned as ballast. The key moment wasn't confrontation. It was silence. After he left that night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear, from recalculation. I opened my laptop and began pulling records the way I used to before a board meeting, slowly, without assumptions. Deeds, emails, filings I'd skimmed but not absorbed, names, dates, patterns. By morning, the shape was clear. My unit wasn't being reassessed on its own. It had been referenced as a stabilizing anchor in a proposed conversion plan. Not sold, not transferred, positioned. My clean ownership history, my recent purchase, my lack of local entanglements, all of it used to suggest legitimacy to a larger structure I hadn't agreed to join. He hadn't forged anything. He'd threatened me. When I asked him to come back, he arrived confident. Not aggressive. Assured. He said he'd expected questions once things reached this phase. He said transitions always felt abrupt when you didn't see the full arc. I asked him why the LLC name included his. He said it was temporary. He said it made coordination easier while things were in flux. He said names changed once assets were consolidated. I asked what happened if I refused. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said refusal was complicated. He said my unit had already been cited in projections. He said withdrawing would require revisions, delays, explanations. He said explanations attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny could lead to reassessment outcomes I wouldn't like. I asked whether that was a threat. He said no. He said it was reality. I noticed how calm he stayed while narrowing the room. I told him to remove my unit from everything. Immediately. I said I wanted my name, my property, my paperwork detached from whatever he was building. He said detachment was an instant. He said systems resisted reversal. He said patience mattered now. That was when I understood the mechanism. He hadn't needed my money. He hadn't needed my signature on anything dramatic. He'd needed my inertia, my willingness to let things continue because stopping them felt harder than allowing them to proceed. I told him I'd be contacting my attorney. He nodded. He said that was my right. He said he hoped I'd consider the cost before acting. He said legal processes created records, and records lived longer than intentions. I didn't respond to that. I walked him to the door. He paused, then said one last thing. He said he believed I was smarter than fear. He said fear made people irrational. I said fear wasn't what I was feeling. After he left, I called my lawyer and said one sentence. I need everything stopped, disentangled, and documented. She didn't ask why. By afternoon, letters were drafted. Notices sent. Requests filed. The tone was formal, not accusatory. Clarification. Withdrawal. Non-consent. The city responded faster than I expected. So did he. He texted once. Just once. He said I was overreacting. He said this could have been mutually beneficial. He said walking away now would make me look unstable. I blocked the number. That evening I sat on the floor of the loft and listened to the building sounds. The elevator, voices in the hallway, pipes settling. Everything ordinary. Everything still mine. For the first time since I'd moved in, the space felt quiet in a way that wasn't provisional. The fallout arrived quietly, in envelopes and subject lines. No one accused me of anything. No one threatened. The city acknowledged receipt of my withdrawal. The assessor's office confirmed my unit would be reviewed independently, outside any group proposal. The language was dry, procedural. Effective. What changed was the temperature. A consultant emailed to say timelines would need revision. A planner asked whether I'd reconsider participation at a later stage. Each message assumed delay, not refusal. I answered once, clearly, and asked that no further correspondence include my address or ownership. They complied. He did not. He showed up in the lobby 3 days later. Not angry, focused. He said we needed to talk because things had become complicated. He said his name was now attached to a structure that no longer functioned without mine. He said people were asking questions. I said that was no longer my concern. He said it could become my concern if the reassessment went poorly. He said valuations were sensitive to context. He said context was shaped by narrative. I asked him to leave. He did, but not before saying something that clarified everything. He said I'd benefited from his guidance up until now and that walking away without consequence wasn't how systems worked. He said balance was always restored somehow. That night, I forwarded the incident to my attorney. She sent a formal notice the next morning requesting no further contact and documenting the attempted influence. The response was immediate. Silence. Within a week, the reassessment numbers arrived. They were higher than I'd hoped but not punitive. Clean. Standalone. Mine. I paid the adjustment without argument. It was the cost of clarity. A month later, a neighbor mentioned the building manager's brother had moved on. No one seemed to know where. The mixed-use conversion stalled, then dissolved. The lobby notices came down. The plants on the roof went unwatered. The system found equilibrium without him. What lingered wasn't loss. It was the understanding of how close I'd come to mistaking movement for progress, guidance for guardianship. How easily authority could be borrowed when no one stopped it. I didn't tell the story to anyone. There was nothing to warn against. The mechanism had been ordinary, too ordinary to dramatize. After it ended, I stayed where I was. I didn't move out of the loft. I didn't change cities. I didn't reinterpret the year as a mistake. I let it remain what it had been, a pause that had almost been redirected. The building returned to anonymity. Notices stopped appearing. The lobby screen went dark. The manager stopped mentioning long-term plans. Repairs took longer again. Ordinary inefficiency resumed, and with it a sense of proportion. I noticed how much quieter my mind was without forward projections that weren't mine. My attorney closed the file. She said there was nothing left to monitor. She said my withdrawal had been clean. I thanked her and didn't ask follow-up questions. A few weeks later, the tax bill arrived reflecting the reassessment. It was higher as expected. I paid it the same day. There was relief in final numbers even when they weren't ideal. Especially then. I stopped forwarding mail. I stopped asking for interpretations. When something arrived from the city, I read it myself and filed it away. The process took longer. It also felt owned. One evening, I stood on the roof where he'd watered the plants months earlier. Most of them were gone now. A few stubborn ones clung to the corners, dry but alive. I didn't water them. It wasn't my responsibility. That distinction mattered. At home, the loft sounded different, less provisional, like a place that had stopped anticipating explanation. I rearranged nothing. I didn't need to mark the change physically. The absence of pressure was enough. What stayed with me wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was the understanding that consent can be eroded not by force, but by momentum. That you can be moved without being pushed if you don't insist on stopping. That night, I turned off the lights and lay in bed listening to the city settle into itself. Traffic faded. Pipes clicked. Somewhere below, a door closed. Everything remained where it belonged. So did I.